Ah, but the Kung Fu Cowboys marathon is on in less than an hour. I guess it better get started. I don't have time for a letter if I'm going to be done painting this fence by 4 o'clock.
Yeah, we're doing the last one.
I am painting. Dear Tim and Moby, how do I do word problems? Thanks, Dorothy. Hey, I could use a word problem to figure out how long it'll take me to paint this fence. A word problem asks a math question without using mathematical notation. Which sounds like it should be simple, but sometimes people have trouble figuring out what a word problem is actually asking. Tim paints 1 board of a fence every 2 minutes, but Moby can paint 14 boards every 2 minutes. If there are 150 boards total, how many hours will it take Tim to paint the fence? When you read a word problem, you should start by reading it closely to figure out what information they're giving you and what they're asking you. And then you usually have to figure out an equation that uses the known values to find the unknown value. So let's see. The question is, how long will it take me to paint the fence? So I know that the answer will be in units of time, like hours. I'm given 2 important pieces of information: how long it takes me to paint each board, and how many boards there are total. How long it takes me to paint each board is the rate. A rate is basically just a speed. It's how much time it takes to do something. Yeah, sometimes word problems give you extra information. Like, I don't need to know how fast you paint. The question is only asking how long it'll take me to paint the fence. Unless you want to help. Well, okay, anyway. I know that I can paint at a rate of 2 minutes per board. That line there means per, which is kind of the same as divided by. So I've got 2 minutes per board, and the fence has 150 boards. Basically, I'm doing 2 minutes of painting 150 times. So I've got to multiply 2 times 150 to get 300 minutes to finish up this painting. To figure out hours, you just divide the minutes by 60, because, there's 60 minutes in an hour. And that makes 5 hours. What if, let's just say you and I both worked at the same time. Tim paints 1 board of a fence every 2 minutes, but Moby can paint 14 boards every 2 minutes. If there are 150 boards total, how many hours will it take them to paint the fence working together? Okay, so together, we can paint 15 boards every 2 minutes. Putting it another way, both of us can paint at a rate of 2 minutes per every 15 boards. With 150 boards, that means 300 divided by 15 is 20. That's only 20 minutes to paint the entire fence. Hey look, it'll work out perfectly. The Kung Fu Cowboys marathon's on in 20 minutes. But hey, you'd better be recording that. I am the great and powerful Tim. Tremble before my awesome... Dear Tim and Moby, what's the deal with the New Deal? From Cowboy.
In order to understand the New Deal, we have to know about the Great Depression. It all started with the stock market crash of October 29th, 1929, better known as Black Tuesday. Well, the stock market crash itself didn't actually cause the Great Depression, it just sort of marked the beginning of a rough 10 years. By 1932, the unemployment rate in the United States hit 25%. That means 1 out of 4 people in the workforce had no job. Back then, if you lost your job, you didn't get any help from the government. So if you were out of work, you were on your own. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president in 1932 when the Depression was at its worst. Roosevelt and his advisors had the idea that by giving people jobs and money, they would encourage people to spend and invest in the economy. They believed that
I'll be right back. You know, knocking the door, mister? Bad boy. Have to watch out your head. Well, I thought I heard something. Well, never mind. I thought I heard something. Well, never mind. Never.
Comes to the Super Cafe. Apparently,
Let's get tending.
would make companies more successful and spur them to hire new workers. FDR started his New Deal, a set of new workers. FDR started his New Deal, a set of programs that would create jobs and give people money. He started by setting up what were called alphabet agencies like the FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which made sure that bank deposits were safe. The PWA, or Public Works Administration, created construction jobs for laborers. Other alphabet agencies helped out farmers, gave loans for new homes, and regulated the stock market. These New Deal programs made people and businesses feel more confident about the economy. The government also helped people by giving them food and money. The New Deal programs were so popular, FDR started a second round of New Deal projects.
The WPA, or Works Progress Administration, created jobs for artists, writers, and musicians who had been left out of the first New Deal programs.
The Social Security Act of 1935 provided unemployment money for the jobless and a program of old age benefits for retired people. Yeah, both of these programs still exist today. Public opinion was mixed about the New Deal. The programs cost a lot of money, and people were nervous about giving the federal government so much power. The same arguments about how much power the federal government should have are still going on today. But FDR stayed popular with voters. His weekly radio addresses to the country, called Fireside Chats, explained his policies in simple terms. People appreciated that. Roosevelt was a persuasive speaker, and he gave Americans hope where they thought they had none. Right, who knows how long the Depression would have gone on without the New Deal? By the way, FDR was such a popular president, he was elected to 4 terms. Okay, that was pretty impressive.
The next day, great pressure.
make icing from egg whites, powdered sugar, and lemon juice.
Moby? Moby? Oh, that was funny. I thought I was stranded in the past during the Great Depression. Can we please go back to our own time now? Nothing's happening. Great, we're stuck here. Might as well answer another letter. Dear Tim and Moby, what was life like during the Great Depression? From Mr. Pony. Looks like we're about to find out. For most people, the Great Depression was a tough time to live. After the stock market crash of 1929, people all over the world were losing their jobs. By 1932, 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Even lots of wealthy people were affected by the Depression. People made money any way they could. Some even begged for it. Until it was outlawed, even kids went to work to help their families eat. Some families relied on bread lines, where government workers handed out food to whoever needed it. And remember, this was before the Civil Rights Movement. So however hard life was in the 1930s, you can bet it was twice as bad for African Americans and other minorities. In the cities, unions organized huge protests over bad working conditions and unpaid wages. They organized sit-down strikes where workers would show up at their jobs and do nothing. Unions gained a lot of influence during the Depression. Hey, let's catch that train! Across the country, young men who couldn't find work lived as hobos. They rode around on trains and camped at night. Farmers may have had the toughest time during the Depression. A long drought hit the Great Plains and dried out a lot of farmland. It caused huge dust storms. The entire area was called the Dust Bowl. With all those farms ruined, millions of people left their homes and tried to make a new life in California. Things weren't much better out there. John Steinbeck wrote all about this in his book The Grapes of Wrath. With times as hard as they were, people turned to the movies to cheer them up. They wanted to forget about their troubles, so comedians like the Marx Brothers and Charlie Chaplin were real popular. Even the music and dancing got a little bit sillier. I guess that just goes to show you that even in the toughest times, people can find something to smile about. Speaking of music, radio brought African American music to a whole new audience. Musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington were adored across the country.
You can find out more about them in our Harlem Renaissance movie.
People who lived through the Depression were scarred by it in ways we can't imagine. Many have said that their family life suffered because everyone was so busy trying to find work. Things didn't get better till around 1940, and then there was a war to deal with. That's a whole different movie, though. If any of your grandparents were alive then, you can ask them about it. Glad that thing's solar powered. Musicians like Louis Armstrong.
Hey, it's Dad's old trumpet. That's the spit valve. Dear Tim and Moby, what's so great about Louis Armstrong? From Roger. Louis Armstrong was probably the most popular and influential jazz musician in history. He was the first jazz superstar, helping it grow from a local style of dance music to a respected art form played by musicians all over the world. Louis Daniel Armstrong was born in New Orleans on August 4th, 1901. He grew up in a poor neighborhood where he sang on the street for pennies. Well, his father abandoned the family when Louis was a baby, and his mom left him with his grandmother. Without much adult guidance, he got into his share of trouble with the police. But it was in a juvenile detention center that young Louis Armstrong learned to play the cornet, a brass instrument similar to the trumpet. By the age of 18, his musical talent and constant practice landed him a job in Kid Ory's band. It was considered the best hot jazz group in New Orleans. Hot jazz was an early form of jazz that emphasized improvisation. Each musician in the band would play his own variation on the melody. Yeah, it could sound pretty chaotic, but the best hot jazz musicians would weave their sounds together and create music that was both fun and original.
Louis was a master of improvisation and soon became popular enough to strike out on his own. He moved to Chicago, where he made records with his own bands, the Hot Five and later the Hot Seven. On these famous recordings, Armstrong introduced the solo to jazz. During a solo, one musician improvises while the rest of the band stays silent or plays quietly in the background. Louis' recordings with the Hot Five and Hot Seven changed jazz forever. The solo soon became the centerpiece of all major styles of jazz music. Louis' records were huge hits, establishing him as an international star and introducing jazz to the world. Oh no, he didn't just play the trumpet. Armstrong pretty much invented jazz singing, too. His voice was gravelly, but he played with the rhythm and melody of lyrics just like they were notes from a trumpet. He also popularized scatting, the singing of nonsense sounds instead of actual words. What? Alright. Scoobity-wop, da-bop, da-bop. Anyway, over the years, Armstrong's celebrity just kept growing. He appeared in Hollywood movies, had his own radio show, and was even sent on a government-sponsored goodwill tour of the world. People started calling him Ambassador Satch after that. Well, his nickname was Satchmo, short for Satchel Mouth, because he has such a big mouth. The world came to love Satchmo as much for his smile and lighthearted personality as his music. He was just a lovable guy. And he loved his work. Louis played hundreds of shows a year up until his death in 1971. Well, I could give it a shot. Dad showed me some stuff once. Oh, cut that out. You did that on purpose. Moby? That's Napoleon crossing the Alps. Let's go. Dear Tim and Moby, who was Napoleon? From Cyril. Napoleon Bonaparte was the... That's Napoleon crossing the Alps. Let's go. Dear Tim and Moby, who was Napoleon? From Cyril. Napoleon Bonaparte was the ruler of France from 1799 to 1814. He was one of the most brilliant military planners in history. The dude took over a huge chunk of Europe during his rule. What? I can say dude, can't I?
He was born in 1769 on the French island of Corsica.
He attended military school and entered the French army at the age of 16. A few years later, in 1789, the French Revolution broke out. Well, a revolution happens when people decide they want to change in their government and they don't pursue it by peaceful means. And in this case, the people of France decided to overthrow their king, Louis XVI, in pursuit of a more democratic government. Well, they put him and his wife, Marie Antoinette, to death. Killing off the king did not bring peace and order. The years following the revolution were chaotic and violent. The revolutionaries fought amongst themselves, and royalists tried to bring a king back into power. Now, Napoleon supported the People's Revolution and rose to the rank of brigadier general in the army. In 1795, he rose to nationwide fame when he led his forces to defeat an armed revolt in Paris. Napoleon famously proclaimed that he cleared the streets with a whiff of grape shot. No, actually grape shot is a type of ammunition used in cannons back then. While his career was on the upswing, Napoleon married a well-connected woman named Josephine de Beauharnais in 1796. After that, he led the French army on campaigns through Italy, Austria, and parts of North Africa.
Well, it wasn't entirely unprovoked. When France executed its king and queen, European monarchs looked on in horror. They feared the democratic revolution would spread to their lands and quickly moved against the new French government. This led to a series of wars between France and most of the major European powers. Napoleon's North African invasion was actually a move against Britain, which used Egypt as a trading route. Though he failed to bring Egypt under French control, Napoleon was greeted as a hero when he returned to Paris in 1799. He'd done all that conquering in Italy and Austria, after all. Napoleon used his popularity to overthrow the government. He had himself elected first consul, which basically made him like a president, only more powerful. And then he went one step further and put in place a new constitution that made him first consul for life. He also instituted the Napoleonic Code, which put France under a single set of laws. In 1804, after someone tried to assassinate him, Napoleon decided to make France a monarchy again. Naturally, he was the emperor. Yeah, he started off supporting a democratic revolution, and he ended up making himself a monarch. And all the while, he continued adding territory to the empire. The battles for control of these areas are collectively known as the Napoleonic Wars. By 1812, most of Western Europe was under French control. But that same year, Napoleon went back on a treaty and invaded Russia. That proved to be a huge mistake. He went in with close to 600,000 men and left with fewer than 40,000. And the rest of Europe ganged up on him in a series of battles. He was forced to abdicate or resign in 1814. Napoleon was sent to live on the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. But amazingly, he staged a comeback from there, reforming his army and taking over France again in 1815. Yeah, there's no stopping some people. He managed to hold power for 100 days before he was defeated for the final time at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium. He was exiled to the island of St. Helena, a British colony in the Atlantic Ocean, where he died in 1821. Phew. Oh yeah, that's Napoleon's bed. Well, one of his beds, I guess. People were a lot shorter in general back then.
Dear Tim and Moby, can you tell us about Lewis and Clark? Thanks, Mrs. McGowan's class. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were two of the most famous explorers in American history. From 1804 to 1806, they led an expedition through the newly annexed Western Territory of the United States. They traveled 7,400 miles from the mouth of the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean and back. All right, enough with the credits. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson approved the Louisiana Purchase, the sale of a huge piece of land from France to the U.S., stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. With the stroke of a pen, our country doubled in size. But neither the French nor the Americans knew exactly how big the territory was, or what it was like. But the hundreds of indigenous nations who lived there did. So, Jefferson put together an expedition to gather info about the land and contact the native people. Jefferson also wanted to take over the fur trade in the West. To lead the group, Jefferson chose his own secretary, Army Captain Meriwether Lewis. And Lewis chose fellow Army officer William Clark to be his partner. Lewis and Clark assembled the Corps of Discovery, a team of 31 people and 1 dog. The Corps was made up entirely of soldiers, with one exception. A black man named York, who was enslaved to William Clark. The Corps set off near St. Louis in May 1804, following the Missouri River westward in 3 boats. During these first days, Clark was busy navigating and making maps. Meanwhile, Lewis was often on shore, studying rocks, animals, and plant life. Over the course of the next 2 years, they encountered more than 50 Native American nations. They held ceremonial meetings following guidelines dictated by President Jefferson. Like this meeting with a group of Hidatsa chiefs. They were urged to trade freely with Americans and accept U.S. authority. Yeah, early on they had a tense encounter with the Lakota, also called the Teton Sioux. The Lakota chiefs weren't impressed by their gifts and presentations. They demanded that the Corps pay a much larger toll to continue up the river. When they tried to prevent the boats from leaving, weapons were drawn. Fortunately, Chief Black Buffalo stepped in and diffused the crisis. But in most cases, meetings with the native people stayed friendly. In fact, the Corps depended on the people they met for survival. By late October, the expedition reached the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples in what is now North Dakota. This was the trade hub of the northern plains for Europeans as well as many native peoples. Winter was setting in, so the Corps built a fort nearby to wait out the season. Living among the Hidatsa was Toussaint Charbonneau, a French fur trader. One of his wives was a Lemhi Shoshone woman, Sacagawea. When Sacagawea was a little girl, her village had been attacked by a Hidatsa war party and she was kidnapped. Like many war hostages, she was later sold to Charbonneau. Lewis and Clark invited the pair to join their expedition as translators. Come spring, they signed on, bringing along their newborn son, Jean-Baptiste. Sacagawea was only about 16, but she quickly became essential to the Corps' survival. She knew which plants to gather for food and medicine, and she acted as a guide. She also smoothed the way with native groups the Corps encountered. Having a woman with a baby along seemed like proof of the explorers' peaceful intentions. That summer, the Corps reached the Great Falls of the Missouri River. It was 80 feet high and 900 feet wide, and the only way through was around. They carried 3 boats and all their supplies on the 18-mile detour. It took 31 days in 100-degree heat, broken by massive storms, including hail. 2 months later, they faced their next big challenge, the Rocky Mountains. To help them across, Sacagawea negotiated a trade for horses with her people, the Shoshone. In August, the group began a dangerous trek over the snow-covered peaks. Food supplies ran low, and the men and horses nearly starved to death. But after 11 desperate days, they finally emerged on the other side. They were saved by the Nimipu, also called the Nez Perce, who helped them recover. Finally, after a year and a half of traveling, they reached the Pacific Ocean. They spent the winter in the territory of the Clackamas people in what is now Oregon, and then set out for home in March of 1806. When they passed back through the Hidatsa villages, Sacagawea, Jean-Baptiste, and Charbonneau stayed behind. In September, the rest of the expedition finally made it back to St. Louis. It had been nearly 2.5 years since they'd left. Well, for one thing, the Corps was the first group from the U.S. to reach the Pacific by land. They also produced the first accurate maps of the American Northwest, over 140 during the course of the journey. They documented hundreds of species of plants and animals, established friendly relations with dozens of Native American nations, and recorded reams of information about their peoples and cultures, and sparked a young country's imagination, inspiring its expansion into the western frontier. Tragically, that would result in great hardship for many of the peoples who'd helped them on their journey. Like so much in American history, opportunity for some came at the cost of great loss for others. In ways they could never anticipate, Lewis and Clark's historic journey changed this country forever. Where'd you learn to fiddle anyway?
This and that deep prison in the middle are the best house. And the 2 bathrooms. And this one also. It's right there. Oh, he has a charge. He's an idiot. He hit me hard with the charge. Amir has an AR. Amir hit him hard. Kill him. And knock him out. There's people on me. Come fast. Please go ahead. Please go ahead. You fight. I'm gonna win. No, we said that. We said that. We're good. We're chilling. Take the charge right away. Take it. Take it. He went upstairs. Who's going? He went upstairs. No, there's 3 million people here. Oh, right there. 14 damage. Help!
Wait,
Help!
200 how do you let go?
Help! No, here, help.
My cash
Yeah, you got that little mirror. Watch out behind you. There's the person on the stairs. There's the person on the stairs, right, Amir? Red.
halkaas waa one food waa kabaha
So we got the extra there. Fill the wall with food.
almost $200
Food shit. I don't know. Their food is...
oh 300 200 340
I'm gonna break this. Oh shit, they killed us. He killed us. And he's finishing us. He finished me. He got some milk back. Yo. Yeah, Amir, honestly, run away. You have no health. And everything you're doing.
adigu waxaan looga yiro dhow iska soo gadaa ay aafa isku mid ma tiiso aafa taasada wada ku soo iibiyo daawo ee faxay ya waa ay sida saad waxa ku soo galay ay sidii baasha shalay ayaan dib u cabiso kartoon halkan inta ha qabo ugu tiiriyo halkan
Yeah? How much skills we got?
Which one?
I got one, and Mel had...
Well, good done with you, not the crab. Oh, organic. I saw nobody else. سجلي اللي دعم ولا اسمه يجيب كتب ولا اسمه يجيب دي لقبوا شغله يبيع هذا I see
Oh, Sam! What the hell I told you?
qisada waa little waxaasoo dhan uu samayn karaa
Put it under your chair.
buugaan soo qada aqriso
The next famous president was Master. The next thing to do is this now. Oh my god. Oh my god. Yes. This Mountain Dew cold red. This is ridiculous. This Mountain Dew cold red. Mountain Dew. Yeah, Mountain Dew cold red. This is really. And it's fine. Now, what do you call it? The normal Mountain Dew. And there's a different one.
Wait, I think we can't finish complete. Let's get started. Next thing we're gonna do is trading card opening. Guys, let's get started. Next, next thing we're gonna do is trading card games the Vegas. Let's get started.